Hello, and welcome again to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark 7, and as always, it's very gratifying to have you with me again today for another discussion of military history. We've been covering a bunch of topics dealing with war at sea lately, and today's episode will be another one. We're going to follow up our discussion of a couple weeks ago when we talked about the 19th century legacy of the United States Navy in the Far East. This presence in the Pacific was embodied in the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, later called the Asiatic Fleet. In the interwar period, this fleet was a force made of cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and river gunboats. It represented American power in the area and was used for the protection of lives and property of Americans in the islands of the region, as well as along the Yangtze River in China. These ships, like those of the European powers, was just one part of the panoply of imperialism in the area, and was intended to be used against the so-called natives, and not as a warfighting force intended to combat other navies. This time we're going to look at the wartime experience of the Asiatic Fleet when the Second World War came. This small force of ships, planes, and submarines would be the only portion of the U.S. Navy in the Southwest Pacific at the outbreak of war, and its officers and men would have the job of facing the initial onslaught. Along with the ships of the Dutch, British, and Australian navies, they faced a grim reality of battle at a disadvantage against a much superior foe. My sources for this one will be the classic Two Ocean War by Samuel E. Morison, a personal favorite of mine. I'll also draw from a book referenced in the previous episode, that is, The U.S. Navy, A History by Nathan Miller, as well as one called The Fleet the Gods Forgot by Walter Winslow. So that being said, let's take our place in the tense atmosphere of the Southwest Pacific of late 1941, where deceptively beautiful tropical scenes and fair weather give little indication of the terrible storm about to break. The American naval presence in the waters of the Western Pacific goes back almost to the beginning of the country's history as an independent nation. By Western Pacific, I mean to indicate the waters off the Chinese and Indo-Chinese coasts, and those around the islands of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. A regular naval presence was established here in the 1830s when the East India Squadron was created. These ships were one of several so-called distant stations that the U.S. Navy maintained throughout the colonial world. In this, it was conforming to the practice of the European powers, who also maintained squadrons of naval vessels in colonial areas. These ships were used as instruments of power to protect their imperial political and commercial interests, as well as to compel respect for their flag. The presence of the American squadron, and the force they represented, would be used to ensure the safety and property of American citizens and commerce in this area. This is reflected in the common missions performed by these ships, which included many punitive expeditions to chastise local rulers known to have killed or mistreated Americans. Other actions in the same vein, all with the primary purpose of protecting American interests and directed against the local population rather than the other imperial powers, comprised the bulk of the East India Squadron's duties. The American presence in the region was only briefly interrupted when the prosecution of the Civil War left no resources for the area, and the East India Squadron disappeared in the 1860s. Not long after the victory of the Union, the U.S. Navy returned to the region, with the establishment of the Asiatic Squadron there in 1868. Like the squadrons of the various European powers that maintain a presence here, the American force was a small one, consisting of the lighter blue water vessels and small craft for use on the rivers. As naval technology advanced, the sailing frigates of the 1830s were replaced by the iron-hulled, steel-driven warships of the late 19th century. Ironclads, such as protected and armored cruisers driven by coal-fired engines, would serve in the later decades of the 19th century, giving way to more modern light and heavy cruiser types, accompanied by destroyers and gunboats for inshore duty. Capital ships such as battleships and battlecruisers were not assigned to the Asiatic Squadron, or as it was known after the turn of the century, the Asiatic Fleet. By the time of the interwar period, most of the ships of the fleet were somewhat obsolescent, but still modern oil-burning turbine-driven ships. Also, submarines, torpedo boats, and reconnaissance aircraft had been added to its organization. This was not a proper battle fleet, and it was not intended to fight fleet actions. The only such action involving the American squadron here in the 19th century occurred during the Spanish-American War, 1898, when vessels of the Asiatic Squadron met and defeated the Spanish Pacific Fleet in Manila Bay. In the normal course of its duties, however, the vessels were intended for the by now traditional purpose of intimidating and overawing the local rulers, including the various Chinese factions. Given the disparity in firepower, even a few second-line ships, supported by a few hundred sailors and marines, could exert a decisive influence over local affairs. In proper colonies, such as the Philippines, the fleet served police functions. In China, the situation was more complex, as the decaying political situation there left large parts of the country politically unstable. Ships of the Asiatic Fleet operated on the Yangtze River, sailing far into the interior of the country. Uninvited by any Chinese authority, their principal occupation was that of responding to calls for protection from endangered Americans, who included diplomatic officials, businessmen, missionaries, and members of service and humanitarian organizations. This imperial system was predicated on the absence of any strong military power in the Pacific itself, which could resist and contest the claims of the Europeans and Americans. The turn of the 20th century would see this situation forever altered by the rise of Imperial Japan. The emerging industrial powerhouse was beginning to develop real power in the last decade of the century, and finally in 1904, with the Russo-Japanese War, this paid off in the decisive defeat of their only immediate imperial rival. A Japanese sphere of influence of quasi-colonial character, somewhat like the protectorate exercised by European empires over nominally sovereign client states, was established in Northeast Asia, including Korea and later Manchuria. This would eventually lead to a sizable Japanese military presence here and in parts of China, beginning in earnest with the First World War. The presence and power of Japan increased throughout the 1920s. By 1932, the Japanese were strong enough to ignore the influence of the foreign contingents in the area. Though still wary of outright war with the likes of the British or Americans, the days were past when a squadron of cruisers and destroyers and a few companies of Marines could cause them to back off. Intelligent observers had recognized the new reality in China, and by extension in the Western Pacific, by the mid-1920s. In 1932, it was demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt in the course of the Shanghai crisis. Here, the city was administered in the so-called international settlement, with districts under the jurisdiction of the various powers that had forced concessions from the dying imperial Chinese government. Japanese aggression against China had caused an outburst of anti-Japanese violence on the part of the Chinese population, and in response, the Japanese began moving troops and ships into the city. These operations violated the zones of the Americans and the other foreign powers, and both the British and Americans sent forces to try to control the situation there. Despite the presence of the British and American ships, including the heavy cruisers USS Houston and HMS Kent, as well as units of American and British Marines, Japanese were undeterred and carried on with their armed actions in the international settlement. Once the American and British officers in charge realized that the Japanese were not intimidated by their presence and intended to drive the Chinese, which had mobilized against them, out of the immediate vicinity of the city, they were forced to acquiesce in the Japanese action. The forces they had available to them were simply much too weak to face off against the Japanese, whose main fleet bases were not far away. Despite the experience of episodes like that in Shanghai, the Europeans and Americans persistently underestimated the threat posed by the Japanese. No doubt a great deal of this attitude was simply due to unintelligent chauvinism. This persistent attitude was very similar to that it exhibited towards the Bolsheviks during their intervention in post-revolutionary Russia and towards the leftists amongst the Spanish Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. It seems to me that the difference in manners and difficulty of communication led to the arrogant among the Anglo-Americans evaluating the Japanese as inferior, as they had branded the scruffy and unprofessional Russians and Spaniards. This kind of automatic devaluation is a hallmark of limited thinking. Race prejudice was certainly no small factor in this costly misevaluation. Whatever the reason, the result was the continuation of the maintenance of the Asiatic Fleet as a slightly augmented version of a turn-of-the-century colonial station fleet. As such, it was formidable against the Malays, Filipinos, or the divided Chinese, but useless against the might of the Japanese fleet. As the decade progressed, the threat became only more clear. Further, the Japanese demonstrated unmistakably their intention to tolerate none of the traditional imperial presence in their desired sphere of influence. The sinking of the USS Panay, one of the gunboats used on the Yangtze River by Japanese aircraft in December 1937, underlined the vulnerability of the traditional imperial instruments of control in the face of the new threat. The Asiatic Fleet did participate in one critical interwar activity that would go far to give the United States a decisive edge over the Japanese, even if the ships were too weak by themselves to deter the aggressive moves in China. Much of the preparatory, cryptological, and signals intelligence work that would lead to the American ability to read the Japanese naval codes and track the movements of their ships by their radio transmissions was performed in the years between 1930 and 1933. This involved the tracking and analysis of Japanese signal traffic during fleet exercises during those years. This was done using the ships and facilities of the Asiatic Fleet. These included shore stations in China and on Guam, as well as specialized gear installed in the light cruiser USS Marblehead. Even if this advantage could be exploited, however, it could probably not offset the comparative weakness of the U.S. forces on the spot. If the Japanese moved against the Asiatic Fleet in force, Americans would face a battle against very grim odds, and it was unlikely that reinforcements from the United States could reach the area in time to affect the outcome of the battle. The rest of the decade saw Japanese hostility to the foreign presence in China increase. Conflict became all but inevitable in 1940. In the late summer of that year, the Japanese joined the tripartite alliance with the Axis powers. This treaty would bring little concrete armed assistance to the Japanese, but it did secure the support of the European dictators in their pursuit of imperial conquests in the Far East. On the 24th of July, 1941, the Japanese moved into the French possessions of Indochina, cutting off the Chinese from areas to the south, and encountering only token resistance from the Vichy authorities. The officer in charge of the Asiatic Fleet was Admiral Thomas C. Hart. This man had taken over the command in July of 1939, and he viewed the deteriorating relations between his country and the Japanese Empire with alarm. He reacted negatively to threatening statements and boastful anti-Japanese claims in the American press, viewing these as bombastic drumbeating for domestic consumption that inflamed an already dangerous situation. He expressed his opinion that, quote, "Nothing is ever gained by threatening the Japanese, their psychology being such that threats are likely to wholly prevent their exercise of correct judgment." While expressed in condescending language, Hart's conclusion was essentially correct, though the reason lay less in the touchy psychology of the Japanese as in their accurate perception of their superior strength in the region. In November 1940, Hart reported to Navy Department that in his estimation further aggressive moves by the Japanese were likely, and these were probably to be directed southwards. On his recommendation, more than 2,000 dependents of American Navy personnel in the region were evacuated. A similar contingent of Army dependents departed a few months later. The Navy Department promised reinforcements, and the ships of the fleet were put through intensive training to meet the likelihood of war. Not long after, the contingents of U.S. Marines stationed in Chinese cities began to withdraw to the Philippines. So let's take a look at exactly what the Asiatic Fleet had to pit against the Japanese. The Asiatic Fleet consisted of the following forces when the Japanese made their move south: 1 heavy and 2 light cruisers, 13 destroyers and a destroyer tender, 6 small S-class submarines and 23 fleet submarines, the latter recently dispatched as reinforcements. Naval aircraft consisted of 28 PBY flying boats and 10 single-engine Kingfisher Scout seaplanes, supported by 4 seaplane tenders, including the old carrier Langley. Minor units included 6 PT boats, 6 minesweepers, and a variety of utility craft, including 2 tankers. An inshore force consisting of coastal and river gunboats for use in the Philippines and on the historic Yangtze River Patrol also was included. The Allied forces in the area could add to this strength, but not significantly. The Dutch, whose colony in the region represented the last major territory they controlled, had a pair of cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 12 submarines. These ships were based on Surabaya and the big island of Java. The Dutch also had a modest air force in the colonies, equipped with American-built Brewster Buffalo fighters and export models of the Martin V-10 bomber. British forces in the region, based on the fortress of Singapore, were small, and their responsibilities elsewhere in the region meant that it was uncertain how many could be available for the defense of anything north of the base. The small Australian Navy was of course present in the region, but they could only add a small number of cruisers and destroyers to the cause. Reinforcements were on the way from other Royal Navy units, including the new battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse, as well as the carrier Indomitable. The latter ran aground in the Caribbean on the way and would not arrive in time to participate in these early battles. The fate of the capital ships above, known to history as Force Z, is well known, and they would never play a major role in the area. Supported by these 3 major units, the Allied forces in the region could have constituted a formidable squadron, though it still would have been heavily outmatched by the Japanese. Even if the capital ships and the Indomitable had reached Singapore, the efficiency of a combined Allied squadron would have been less than optimal. The Allies had made no plans for common action before the war. Communications and liaison procedures were lacking, a bad situation that was exacerbated by the language barrier between the Dutch and the Americans and Commonwealth navies. These difficulties would magnify the problems they would face in battle against a single, superior enemy. Perhaps worst of all, the Allies had very little in the way of air cover, relying on land-based forces that were widely separated and acting in an uncoordinated way. This slender Allied force was up against a Japanese force composed of 10 battleships, 10 carriers, 18 heavy and 18 light cruisers, 113 destroyers and 63 submarines, supported by hundreds of first-class land-based bombers and fighters. So now let's take a look at the major units of the Asiatic Fleet. The flagship of the squadron was the USS Houston. This was her initial assignment after completion, assumed on her arrival in Manila Bay in February 1931. She was replaced in this role by the cruiser Augusta in November 1933, at which point she left for San Francisco to join the scouting force. She would spend most of the next 5 years operating in the waters off of the west coast of North America, and would serve as flagship of the U.S. fleet itself during the period September 19th to December 28th, 1938. She was overhauled in 1939 and sent back to the Pacific, first to Hawaii, and then to rejoin the Asiatic Fleet, arriving once again in Manila in November 1940, just as the threat of war began to magnify. The Houston was a Northampton-class heavy cruiser armed with a main battery of 9 8-inch, 203mm 55 caliber guns and 3 turrets, with a second battery of 4 5-inch, 127mm 25 caliber dual-purpose guns and 6 1.1-inch or 28mm anti-aircraft guns. She also carried a pair of triple 21-inch or 533mm torpedo tubes. Her armor was moderate. An engineering plant consisting of 8 oil-fired boilers and 4 steam turbines fitted with reduction gearing gave her a top speed of perhaps 33 knots in good condition. This machinery developed a total of almost 110,000 shaft horsepower, applied by 4 screws. The Houston also carried a pair of catapults for launching float planes, 4 of which were carried. The Houston was a modern and powerful ship, somewhat dated but still a formidable opponent against ships of its own class. It's also in good mechanical condition in 1941, although its late 1920s design shared the inadequate anti-aircraft armament of most warships of the time. The light cruiser USS Marblehead formed the other half of the Asiatic Fleet's complement of cruisers. This is an Omaha-class vessel completed in 1922, displacing 9,500 tons fully loaded. It was powered by 4 steam turbines, developing a total of 90,000 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a respectable top speed of 35 knots. It was lightly armored, lacking a normal belt and having a protection scheme similar to the protected cruisers of the preceding century. That is, armor concentrated around machinery spaces and an accounting tower. The gun turrets were unarmored and protected only from blast and splinters. The main battery consisted of 6-inch, 150mm 53 caliber guns, 4 mounted in twin turrets fore and aft, and another 8 mounted in single casemate mounts along the broadsides. In 1942, her anti-aircraft armament was made up of 4 3-inch or 76mm dual-purpose guns and several 50 caliber machine guns. Her class was also one of the last American cruiser types to carry a torpedo armament, in this case 2 triple-tube 21-inch installations. She was fitted with catapults and carried a pair of float planes. In 1942, these were Vought OS-2U Kingfishers, which had replaced the older Curtiss Seagulls in 1940. During the interwar period, she served in American squadrons operating in Latin America and Chinese waters, and was not made a permanent part of the Asiatic Fleet until 1938. Another light cruiser was also on hand in the region when the time came. This is the USS Boise, and although this ship was not formally a part of the Asiatic Fleet, fight as part of that command. This Brooklyn-class vessel was very up-to-date, having entered service in mid-1938. It ended up fighting with the Asiatic Fleet due to circumstance, specifically a convoy escort mission that brought it to Manila on December 4, 1941. She would still be in the Philippines when the Japanese struck, and would be incorporated into Task Force 5, the main surface combat force of the Asiatic Fleet, to participate in the defense. Like the Marblehead, she was armed with 6-inch guns, but there were 15 of them and they were all mounted in turrets, 5 triple turrets to be exact. The anti-aircraft battery is once again built around 5-inch 25 caliber dual-purpose guns, 8 in number, supplemented by 8 50 caliber machine guns. She carried no torpedoes. Unlike the Marblehead, she had armored decks, turrets, and a belt along the waterline. The ship also carried a pair of catapults and 4 float planes. She carried a slightly less powerful engineering plant than the Houston, but could match her top speed of 33 knots. The 13 destroyers were Clemson-class vessels. This class was a revision of the early Wickes-class ships that had formed the destroyer component of the Asiatic Fleet, along with most other U.S. commands, at the time of the 1932 Shanghai crisis. Like the Wickes, they were World War I era designs, though most of the Clemsons were built in the immediate post-war years. They were similar enough to their preceding class that the two classes are often lumped together in many sources, sharing the terms 4-stacker or 4-piper due to the number of funnels. They displaced a little less than 1,400 tons fully loaded, and were driven by 2 geared turbines that could bring them up to a speed better than 35 knots in perfect conditions. They carried an armament identical to the Wicks class, with the relatively light gun complement consisting of four 4-inch 102mm guns and a single 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, with a somewhat heavier than normal torpedo loadout of 4 triple tubes using the 21-inch Mark 8 torpedo. Anti-submarine equipment included the normal racks for rolling depth charges off the stern, as well as a wide gun for throwing patterns. The ships on station at the time were the Pope, Perry, Alden, Paul Jones, John D. Edwards, Whipple, Edsel, Stewart, Barker, Parrott, Bulmer, John D. Ford, Alden, and Pillsbury. These ships were built in the immediate post-World War I years and were 20 years old or more when they were called upon to face the challenge of combat. The destroyers were supported by the tender Black Hawk. This is a larger, 5,500-ton vessel designed to provide maintenance support and resupply to a flotilla of destroyers. Her facilities included such things as machine shops, foundry and metalworking equipment, as well as specialized repair facilities for such things as optical and instrument repair and the adjustment of complicated systems such as fire control computers and rangefinders. Distillation of fresh water and electrical generating stations to supply ships undergoing maintenance were also among the services performed on the tender. Like their counterparts that serviced submarines, torpedo boats, and seaplanes, tenders allowed destroyers, which had very little room aboard for items that were not strictly necessary, to operate far from shore bases for an extended period of time. Tenders such as these, along with supply vessels, would form the basis for the fleet train that would eventually grow into the massive organization needed to support the huge U.S. fleets fighting thousands of miles from their bases a few years later. Submarines in the fleet included 6 older S-boats, the S-36 through S-41. These were built in the early 1920s and were very typical diesel-electric boats displacing 900 tons on the surface. They were armed with a 4-inch deck gun and 4 torpedo tubes in the bow for 21-inch torpedoes. 12 torpedoes were normally carried. The S-boats were obsolete at the outbreak of war, and their handling was relatively clumsy. A future admiral, Hyman Rickover, who served on one, credited their, quote, faulty, sooty, dangerous, and repellent engineering with inspiring his desire to raise the mechanical standards of U.S. Navy equipment. The 6 S-boats were joined by a contingent of 23 newer fleet submarines after Admiral Hart's November 1940 report that Japanese aggression was likely. These would be the only part of the promised reinforcements that would actually reach the Asiatic Fleet in time to be useful. These subs would come from a few different classes. The Sargo-class boats were typical of the kind sent. These were larger, 1,500-ton boats built between 1937 and 1939. They were faster than the S-boats and had longer endurance, and carried a torpedo armament twice as large, including 24 21-inch torpedoes fired from 8 tubes, 4 in the bow and 4 in the stern. The deck gun, however, was smaller, a 3-inch piece, more typical of American designs. A few machine guns were also carried to provide some degree of protection against aircraft. 7 gunboats were part of the Asiatic Fleet. These are relatively small, flat-bottomed shallow draft vessels intended for use in shallow coastal waters or on the rivers of China. They were intended to fight against minor land forces in a support role rather than against other naval vessels. They were in general slow, clumsy, and protected only against small arms fire. In November of 1941, these gunboats on the Yangtze River Patrol were ordered to leave China and head south to join the rest of the American force in the Philippines. This was the end of the imperial presence in China. The commander of the patrol, Admiral William Glassford, arrived in Manila on the 5th of December with 5 of his boats. The 2 oldest, the USS Wake and the USS Tutelia, had been unable to make the journey and had been left behind. They were the last American forces in China to have been withdrawn, and along with the rest of the Asiatic Fleet began to deploy to the area of the southern Philippines and Borneo in anticipation of the Japanese attack that seemed increasingly imminent. The expected storm hit on December 8th when news of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the crippling of the U.S. battle fleet reached the Philippines. U.S. naval strategy in the Pacific called for the forces in the region, assisted by the Army Air Forces in the islands, to fight a delaying action against the Japanese until the Pacific Fleet could mobilize and begin offensive westwards from Hawaii. The destruction of the battle fleet meant that the Americans in the region were on their own for the time being. The prospect was made dimmer when the Japanese began their attacks on the Philippines themselves. Japanese airstrikes caught most of the U.S. Air Forces in the Philippines on the ground, securing total domination of the air without fighting a significant air battle. On the 10th, unopposed Japanese bombers devastated the Navy's principal base in the archipelago, the Cavite Naval Yard. The foresight of Admiral Hart in withdrawing the majority of his units to the south meant that only the submarine Sea Lion and the submarine tender Canopus were present when the base was hit. On the same day, the British capital ships, which had sortied from Singapore to intercept a suspected Japanese invasion convoy headed for Malaya, were caught by Japanese bombers. The battleship and battlecruiser were not given air cover, and both were sunk by successive waves of deadly dive bombing and torpedo planes. This left the fleet base at Singapore exposed. Japanese forces were soon advancing overland towards the unprotected fortress. It would fall on the 15th of February 1942. This left only Surabaya as a viable base for Allied operations. The Allied naval units in the area quickly realized the need for concerted action against the Japanese onslaught, and soon after Admiral Hart arrived in Java, on the 15th of January, they formed themselves into the so-called ABDA Command. This was an acronym that stood for American, British, Dutch, and Australian. Admiral Hart was selected to lead the ABDA forces afloat, while Dutch commanders led the combined ground forces, and British officers the combined air forces, all under the overall direction of British Field Marshal Sir Archibald Percival Wavell. Though this seems like a simple arrangement, a multitude of difficulties arose due to the overlapping areas of responsibility, made ABDA command a very unwieldy instrument. This would be somewhat remedied after the fall of Singapore, when Field Marshal Wavell was recalled to India, and Admiral Hart was sent back to the U.S. This left the ABDA Naval Command under the leadership of Dutch Vice Admiral Conrad Helfrich, while the American forces were commanded by Admiral Glassford, commander of Task Force 5. The first major action of elements of the Asiatic Fleet as part of the ABDA Command occurred on January 24th, as a result of Japanese moves against the oil-producing town of Balikpapan on the island of Borneo. The oil of the Dutch East Indies was one of the principal objectives of the Japanese southward thrust, and while the Americans were fighting for their lives in the Philippines, the Japanese fleet moved south past the embattled archipelago in an attempt to seize the oil-producing regions as soon as possible. Right before the move on Balikpapan, they had taken the oil fields of Tarakan, also on Borneo. These had been set alight by the retreating Dutch, and a convoy of small transports was loaded, sent along the coast, to seize the fields there intact if they could. They were too late, and the Dutch had torched Balikpapan's facilities as well, and the burning oil tanks would form the backdrop for the action to follow. The Dutch army defenders numbered perhaps 1,500, supported by a few squadrons of Martin B-10 bombers and Brewster Buffalo fighters. A PBY from Patrol Wing 10 detected the Japanese convoy on the way in, and strikes by Dutch planes managed to sink a pair of transports. Another was reported dispatched by a Dutch submarine, the K-18. The landing force made Balikpapan on the afternoon of the 23rd without further losses, and landing was made without opposition. While the transports were unloading, however, a division of U.S. destroyers under Commander Paul Talbot, consisting of the ships Paul Jones, Pope, Parrott, and John D. Ford, approached. The newer modern destroyers the Japanese had used to escort the convoy on the way in were engaged in a hunt for the Dutch submarine, and had left the transports guarded by only 3 older, less formidable vessels. At 2:45 a.m., the Americans found the Japanese landing ships, backlit by the oil fires ashore, and mounted a surprise torpedo attack on the assembled Japanese shipping, which were reported to consist of 12 transports plus the 3 escorts. 4 of the transports and 1 of the escorts were struck by torpedoes and lost. Further attacks with guns and torpedoes damaged another pair of ships. The Americans got away almost scot-free, taking only minor damage to the John D. Ford. At 4 a.m., the Americans had withdrawn, leaving 7 of the Japanese ships burning. This successful action was the first major surface engagement of U.S. naval forces since the Spanish-American War. Shortly after this action, on the 27th, the U.S. Asiatic Fleet was formally deactivated, and the assets under its command transferred to the new Southwest Pacific Command. This was the formal end of the fleet, but as this was an end in name only, we'll go on to recount the rest of the short campaign that the men, planes, and vessels of this fleet prosecuted against the invasions. The successful raid against transports at Balikpapan did not slow the Japanese tide that was submerging the colonial empires, but it did buoy up the confidence of the Allied naval leaders in the ABDA Command. On the 1st of February, air reconnaissance noted a buildup at Balikpapan, with another invasion convoy of 20 transports and an escort of 3 cruisers and about 10 destroyers. A strike force of Dutch and American ships under Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman was assembled and set out to attack the Japanese on the 3rd. That morning, the ABDA force was spotted by Japanese planes while taking on supplies at the Gili Islands. The planes did not attack, and at midnight the ships sailed for the northeast tip of Java. On the way, they received words that the Japanese had sailed, apparently for Surabaya by way of the Makassar Strait. On the morning of the 4th, The ABDA ships headed for the strait, intent on intercepting the Japanese force, now estimated to include 3 cruisers and 18 destroyers. The Allied ships involved were the Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Tromp, the American cruisers Houston and Marblehead, and a mixed American-Dutch destroyer force including 3 Dutch and 4 U.S. ships. Later that morning, they were located by Japanese bombers near the Kangin Islands. The planes came in 4 V-shaped formations and made concentrated attacks on the cruisers. The Marblehead was struck by 2 direct hits and 2 near misses, blowing a hole in her bottom and wrecking her machinery spaces, causing the cruiser to lose control of her steering gear. The ship was unable to sail except in circles. The Houston managed to avoid the bulk of the attacks, but 1 bomb struck her a severe blow, rendering her No. 3 8-inch turret out of action. A very worrying problem was uncovered with the anti-aircraft ammunition aboard the Houston during this action, a very high proportion of which proved defective. The Japanese then concentrated on the Dutch ships, but these got off with only superficial damage. The attacks convinced Admiral Dorman, however, that to proceed towards the interception without air cover was foolhardy, and since none was available, he turned his ships back. They split into 2 groups and made their way to the Dutch harbor at Chiletjap, and Marblehead limped along, having freed its steering gear to some extent, though the rudder was still locked 90 degrees port, and she was only able to make way by steering with the engines. Houston was patched up and able to remain in service, though without her No. 3 turret. Marblehead required more extensive work, and after temporary repairs of the Dutch base, withdrew through the Indian Ocean and around Africa back to the United States. The fleet had little respite, however, as 2 weeks later on the 18th, Japanese troops landed on the island of Bali. The move on Bali had to be opposed, since airfields there in Japanese hands would enable their bombers to reach the main naval base at Surabaya. The ABDA forces were scattered throughout the area, and with little time to coordinate them, they were directed towards the island. By the time the Allied ships were able to close on the area, most of the Japanese ships had withdrawn, having already landed their invasion force. Only a pair of transports, one of which had been badly damaged by the American planes, escorted by 4 destroyers, remained there. The hurried nature of the ABDA response meant that their assets arrived in the area piecemeal, and the Japanese would have to deal successively with 2 groups of warships that caught them in the Bandung Strait. First came the Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Java, with 2 American and 1 Dutch destroyer. These spotted the Japanese vessel at 2200 hours and closed in to open fire. After an ineffective exchange of gunfire, the Dutch cruisers cleared the area to allow an unrestricted torpedo attack by their destroyers. The Japanese raced in and launched torpedoes as well. At 2240, one of the Japanese fish struck the Dutch destroyer Piet Hein square midships. She blew up and sank almost immediately. The Japanese destroyers Asashio and Oshio pressed the attack and engaged the 2 remaining Americans with gunfire, chasing them from the scene and compelling them to follow the Dutch cruisers who had continued on through the strait and out of the battle area. After their retreat, the 2 Japanese destroyers, mistaking their identities in the dark, fired at one another for a while longer, but without any effect. A few hours later, another group of ABDA ships found the same pair of Japanese destroyers. This group was made up of the Dutch cruiser Tromp and the U.S. destroyers John D. Edwards, Parrott, Pillsbury, and Stewart. The U.S. destroyers attacked with torpedoes but scored no hits, and the Japanese then closed in and engaged the Tromp with gunfire, landing 11 hits on the cruiser and badly damaging her. Both Japanese ships were damaged as well, and the action was broke off. The other pair of Japanese destroyers, having brought their transport out of the danger zone, were ordered to double back and attack the oncoming ABDA ships. These 2, the Arashio and the Michishio, joined the action about 2:30 a.m., but had less luck than their sisters. The Michishio was plastered by shells from the cruiser and the 2 destroyers, lost power, and eventually had to be towed away from the scene. The U.S. destroyer Stewart was hit in the engineering spaces, flooding one of her engine rooms. Not long after, both sides turned away and the battle was over. These 2 actions, those of the Makassar Strait and 2-part Bandung Strait battle, deprived the Allies of 2 cruisers, the Marblehead and the Tromp, second of which sailed away south to Australia for repairs, as well as the destroyer Piet Hein sunk. Houston continued in ABDA command service, but was significantly handicapped by the loss of her after turret and serious problems revealed by the action with her anti-aircraft ammunition. No significant damage was done to the Japanese forces involved, and the Allied naval squadrons were unable to prevent either of the invasion convoys from accomplishing their missions. Perhaps worse, the landing at Bali had been a total success. Elements of the Japanese 48th Infantry there had captured the vital airfield intact. The absence of friendly air cover was a large factor in the Makassar Strait action, which is another example of how vulnerable unsupported ships were in the face of the newer, much more dangerous aircraft and tactics used by the Japanese airmen. With Bali in Japanese hands, no part of the ABDA operational area was safe. The largest and most decisive action in the career of the ABDA force, and the elements of the erstwhile Asiatic Fleet incorporated therein, was soon to come, and with it the end for the Allied cause in the area. This engagement, the major naval showdown between the ABDA command and the Imperial Japanese Navy, is known to history as the Battle of the Java Sea. The Japanese made their move on Java itself on the 27th, when an invasion convoy began to approach the island through the Makassar Strait. The troops were escorted by a Japanese naval task force consisting of 2 heavy cruisers, the Nachi and the Haguro, light cruisers Jinsu and Naka, and a division of 14 destroyers. These were very powerful ships, especially the heavy cruisers, which were considerably better armed than their Allied counterparts, especially now that the Houston had lost part of her 8-inch battery. The ABDA command knew that the invasion was coming, and put together a task force of their own to meet it. This was called the Eastern Strike Force, and would be the largest group of Allied warships to fight in any of the battles in the initial Japanese offensive. Ships of all 4 ABDA navies participated. The fleet was headed by 2 heavy cruisers, the Houston and the British HMS Exeter. The latter, a York-class vessel, had recently joined the ABDA force, and the presence of this ship, which had famously taken part in the battle against the German pocket battleship Graf Spee in the 1939 Battle of the River Plate, raised the drooping morale of the sailors. The 2 remaining Dutch light cruisers De Ruyter and Java, as well as the Australian Perth, sailed with them. The cruiser force was accompanied by 3 British, 2 Dutch, and 4 United States destroyers. The 2 forces made contact in the Java Sea late in the afternoon of the 27th, and for the next several hours would duel on and off with each other, as Admiral Dorman, commanding the ABDA force again, attempted to evade the Japanese cruisers and get at the troop ships. A long-range gunnery exchange on initial contact was almost entirely ineffective, as both sides failed to achieve much accuracy. A stroke of luck occurred for the Japanese, however, as the only telling hit achieved by either side in this first exchange was a Japanese 8-inch shell which punched into the Exeter's innards, destroying some of her boilers and seriously reducing her speed. Unable to maneuver with the rest of the ABDA ships, she was forced to retire towards Surabaya, escorted by the Dutch destroyer Witte de With. Loss of this ship was a disproportionate blow to the ABDA force. Not only was the ship one of the most powerful and prestigious in the fleet, but it was also the only one equipped with radar. For the next 5 hours, the Allied ships would try to get past the Japanese warships, only to be blocked and compelled to break off and try again. Torpedo salvos were launched by both sides, with little effect except for a single Japanese long lance that connected with the remaining Dutch destroyer, the Kortenauer, which broke in half and sank. Another destroyer, a British one this time, the HMS Jupiter, struck a mine or perhaps was hit by a torpedo and was lost. As the daylight began to fail, the Allied destroyers, having expended all their torpedoes, broke off and returned towards Surabaya. The climax of this confused and frustrating action came near midnight, when the Allied cruiser sought a decisive action against the Japanese escort force. At 2300 hours, a violent long-range artillery duel began, and the cruisers blasted at one another without landing many damaging hits. As the ships closed and the gunfire duel intensified, the 2 Dutch cruisers were suddenly and simultaneously struck by multiple Japanese torpedoes, part of a massive combined salvo fired by the Japanese line. Both ships went down quickly, taking with them all but 111 of their crews, including Admiral Dorman. The old Dutch sea warrior, having ordered the remaining cruisers to run for Tjeletjap, rowed his flagship, the De Ruyter, to the bottom. The entire Dutch naval force, except for a handful of submarines and destroyers, had been wiped out. The Battle of the Java Sea was the end of Allied sea power in the Western Pacific until American comeback later that year in the Bismarcks. The Japanese victory was completed the next day, when in 2 separate actions the ABDA cruisers that had escaped destruction the night before were hunted down and sunk. The Exeter, having made Surabaya and patched up her boiler room damage, departed for the British base at Ceylon, or modern Sri Lanka, on the 28th, in company with the destroyers HMS Encounter and USS Pope. The same day, the Japanese landing force made landfall on Java and began the final campaign against the Dutch. On the 1st of March, the Exeter and her escorts were caught on their way out of the Java Sea by a force of 4 Japanese heavy cruisers and several destroyers. They stood a little chance against such heavy odds, and the 2 British vessels were sunk in the ensuing action. The American destroyer managed to extricate herself from the melee somehow and disengage, only to be caught and destroyed by Japanese planes later that day. The Perth and Houston, retiring through the Sunda Strait towards Tjeletjap, avoided the Japanese for a couple days until they ran into ships of the invasion fleet. This action, also on March 1st, saw the American and Australian cruisers engaged by a force of 3 cruisers and several destroyers. The cruisers put up an obstinate defense in a very hard-fought night action, but to no avail. Both were sunk. A Dutch destroyer, the Evertsen, that had been detailed to accompany them, but whose departure had been delayed, unfortunately caught up with them soon after the battle began and was dispatched by a pair of Japanese destroyers. Aside from a few doomed torpedo boats and gunboats fighting the desperate losing battles in the Philippines, the Allied naval presence in the Southwest Pacific had been reduced to a few destroyers, submarines, and auxiliaries retiring towards Australia. The defeat of the ABDA command was the true end of the age of European and American imperialism in the Far East. It is for this reason that I feel that the story of the ABDA command and the Asiatic Fleet belong more to the interwar period than to the war itself. In a longer perspective, this campaign seems to be like the very end of a process that began in the previous century, and as part of the final submergence of the 19th century order in Asia. The Westerners would not be absent for long, however, and we begin their reconquest of the area later in 1942. The story of Western hegemony in the Pacific, which would be suspended for a few years by the Japanese interlude, would resume in 1945. This new chapter, one which would last for the rest of the century, would be an overwhelmingly American one. So that's about it for the story of the Asiatic Fleet, course of World War II. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting and enjoyable. I've always found the initial parts of World War II, both in the European theaters and the Pacific, to be of the most interest to me. I think this is because the atmosphere of the war at this time is so much more evenly balanced. In the Pacific after Midway, like in Europe after Stalingrad, the story is so often one of that of the Axis being inevitably ground down by the overwhelming and growing superiority of the Allies. In historical terms, looking at the events as a story, I think this is much more stimulating than what would be happening in this area in 1944, when each battle seems to be simply a reiteration of an inevitable, though costly American victory over a Japan that had in reality lost the war long before. That being said, I don't wish to romanticize the story out of any perspective. As exciting as I find these actions, like the Battle of the Java Sea, where it really seems like anything can happen, it can't be forgotten that they involve hundreds or thousands of horrible deaths. Nonetheless, there's a part of my mind that will always think of these campaigns as constituting, in the words of one Englishman whose name I can't recall, ripping good history. So next week, if everything goes as expected, we'll be returning to the Spanish Civil War. For once, we won't be covering a naval topic. Instead, we'll take a look at the use of tanks and other armored vehicles on the Spanish battlefield. This conflict was the first major use of these new weapons of mechanized warfare, and the theories of their design and proper use in combat would face their first real test here. So I hope you'll join me for that. This week's episode may well be early, as I'm quarantining myself in response to the pandemic, as I hope you are as well. Things aren't so bad here in the US yet, especially out in the boonies where I live, but it seems like this is the only responsible thing to do to protect those I care about, as well as the rest of my fellow Americans. I myself, as a robust and relatively fit man in his 40s, have little to seriously fear, I think, but Mrs. 7 and Grandma 7 are in a more precarious situation, and I hope you'll remember the more vulnerable among us as well. A crisis like this demands unity, courage, and cheerfulness in the face of danger, as students of military history know so well. We also know that the alternative is demoralization, and demoralization leads to panic, panic leads to rout, and rout can end in massacre. So, as the British say, keep calm and carry on, and best of luck to you all. I intend to carry on regardless until I'm incapacitated. With any luck, we'll overcome this like we've overcome so many other challenges to our lives and happiness. Till next week then, this is Mark 7 wishing you all the best.